So I may have revolutionized the Adirondack chair with my design, but that still wasn't good enough for you guys.
Now to evolve this into
Have
a
you ever
folding
thought of
model.
making a
How
folding
about
Adirondack chair
plans? Do you have plans or
Okay,
templates
now
for
folding,
folding,
please.
Do you have a digital plan?
Do you
for
plan on
folding
making a
Adirondack?
folding version?
Is there any plan to make a folding?
Alright, fine. Are you happy now? I was a little reluctant to do this because every folding Adirondack chair I've sat in has felt either flimsy or uncomfortable, so I spent days obsessing over redesigning the chair from the ground up to make it fold while retaining as much of the stiffness as the original as possible, and the super comfy curved seat and curved back too. It's something I wasn't entirely convinced that I could do, but it ended up working out in miniature, so let's try it now with the real thing. I partnered with Veterans United Home Loans for this build. They reached out and challenged me to create a project that a local veteran could use in their new home, and I thought a pair of these chairs would be a perfect fit. More on that later. After building way too many Adirondack chairs, I've picked up a bunch of little tips and tricks. I'm going to share those with you as I build. I began with 4/4 rough sawn white oak and plane it down to a hair over 7/8 of an inch thick. To make the build easy, I cut out templates of each of the parts using my CNC. These templates, along with the plans for this new chair design, are available on my website. This way, all you need to do is trace out the parts on your lumber, and they can be used as router templates later, too. This is the strategic part of the build, where you carefully lay out all of these pieces, playing Tetris to reduce as much waste as possible. Nesting parts like these two arms here, and picking the best grain for each part, plus avoiding knots and cracks and whatnot. For simple pieces like the back and seat slats, I usually just mark a rough length, since most of these cuts will happen on the table saw with fences and stop blocks. I cut all the boards down into a more manageable size. This is another consideration during layout, lining up parts so you can easily chop up the board. With all the curves on these parts, it can be tempting to just jump right over to the bandsaw now, but there's a lot of parts with straight edges too, so I first run the boards over my jointer when any of these straight edges are on the edge of the board. This gives me a perfectly flat reference surface to run against the fence of the table saw when cutting these parts down to width. Now that's a lot of offcuts there, Jackman. Well, the nice part of building these from white oak is that I can clean up the scraps, glue them back together, plane them smooth, cut them back into strips, glue them together again, and cut the edges smooth. The scraps are going to get tossed away anyway, so now I have myself a few end grain cutting boards entirely for free. I think that's what the kids these days call girl math. Moving on, all these pieces with square ends are cut using my table saw sled. For the back slats that I just marked at rough length earlier, I use the newly square cut ends to line up my template and trace the final length. This time I use a red pencil to make sure I don't mix up the two marks. For the rest of the square end pieces, all I do is dial in my stop block on my table saw sled and then go to town cutting all these parts to length. There's a couple angled cuts too, which I can just do with the same table saw sled. Now it's finally time for curves. So I head over to the bandsaw and carefully cut all of the curves, cutting just outside the line. Later I can sand my parts perfectly down to the line. Now is later. Over to the edge sander we go. I touch all of the straight edges on the sander just to remove any of the cut marks that the table saw blade left, and at the same time I smooth out the outside curves to bring the bandsaw cuts down to the line. The inside curves are also done on this sander, but on the end, where it's basically just a giant spindle sander, it's a super useful sander, but dust collection leaves a lot to be desired. There's some frayed edges and pencil lines left behind by all of this, so I head over to the sander with good dust collection, my drum sander. This cleans up both faces of the parts, and this also is when I dial in my pieces to exactly 7/8 of an inch finished thickness. Where all the parts connect, there's a bunch of holes to pre-drill. I wait to mark these out using my templates until now, so that way the marks don't disappear from the previous sanding step. After marking the holes, I also like using a hole punch to mark the center of the holes. This helps to more accurately align the drill bit later. And now is later. Drilling holes, smaller ones where the screws go, larger ones where the bolts go. For any of the repetitive holes, I set up a fresh zero clearance table surface with some CA glue and blue tape, so it's easy to remove later. And I set my mag switch switchable magnetic fence and magnetic stop block in position and go to town again. And when I get back from town, I drill out the rest of the holes. Normally, it's not necessary to glue parts together for an Adirondack chair, but this design is a little bit different. I use Thixo, which is a thickened epoxy adhesive from Total Boat that mixes itself. It's bomb-proof for outdoor applications like this. And I use it to stick these two pieces together, which are part of the linkage connecting the back of the chair to the front legs. And then for one of these chairs, I'm adding a leg rest, so I glue the rails for that in place now too. Once cured, I smooth out those seams on the sander, and then head over to the router to add a 3/8 inch round over to all of the edges that you'll be in contact with when you sit in the chair. The thing that I love about this design is that the finished product looks complex with all of its curves, but it's actually a super approachable build, even for a newbie. Because it's all just square cuts that can be done with basic tools. If you don't have the bougie tools that I have, you can just use a circular saw and a jigsaw to cut out the parts, a belt sander to sand them, a hand drill to drill the holes, and a handheld router to round over the edges. Although, you know you want to be bougie like me. One last thing before assembling the chairs, there's a couple of defects on the back side of some pieces, so I go ahead and fill those with a 𝐕𝐞𝐿 resin, which cures almost instantly, and then I can sand it flush. Now finally, the fun part, assembly. This is done in sections. First the back of the chair, where I measure for center, square, and parallel, before pre-drilling and screwing the parts together. I wait to pre-drill some of the holes until I get to this stage in case there's any slight variations in assembly. That way my screw is perfectly centered in the piece that I'm attaching to. This helps prevent cracks and splits. The back is set aside for later. Now is the front legs. You can see I still don't fully trust my math on this pivot, but it seems fine. Once lined up, I clamp and screw the arm support bracket to the front leg and set that aside for later. The seat of the chair is made up of these big main leg pieces and a bunch of seat slats. I start with the front slat and the back slat, which I space off the back of the chair. Before screwing everything in place, I measure the diagonals to check for square and tweak the seat if needed before spacing out all of the seat slats evenly and screwing them down. Then I set that part aside for later. Wait, no, I actually need that part now. Bring it back. The front leg is attached to the big main leg with a carriage bolt, washer, and lock nut. This is one of the pivot points. I tighten these fully for now to make chair assembly easier, but I'll loosen them up later to allow for it to pivot. The front support between the front legs helps to keep the chair stable, despite the folding mechanism wanting to make it all wobbly, but this counteracts that. The back of the chair is held in place with a couple of clamps while I install the little rear linkages. The longer linkage connects the front leg to the back of the chair. I make it parallel with a workbench and screw it to the back of the chair, which finalizes the linkage between all the pivot points. The arms of the chair go on last. I measure them for center, clamp them to the long linkage, and then remove those to make them easier to screw together. You want to be really careful here not to have your screws poke through the top of the arm, because that wouldn't be very comfortable. One of these chairs I'm making has a leg rest, which is assembled in the same way as the seat of the chair. Plus there's front legs that are bolted on. The only difference with this chair is that the front slat attaches to the leg rest instead of to the chair itself. Would you look at that? It actually works. Just over a foot thick when folded, and still retains all of the curves and even the hidden leg rest too. Now there's someone who's way too proud of themselves. Alright, get back to work. Once the chairs are assembled, I can flip them upside down and tape around the edges of the bottom legs. What I'm doing here is sealing them. I like to seal this area with epoxy since it's in direct contact with the ground, and it's the most likely location for rot. For finish, I'm applying oil to these chairs. Otherwise, I'd apply epoxy to the entire surface to get that super fancy looking yacht quality varnish finish on top of the epoxy. The tape holds back the epoxy while it cures. This creates a bit of a lip around the perimeter, but I'll sand that down flat later. So we're now at this stage of the process, where I disassemble the chair that I just assembled. This allows me to sand the epoxy on the feet, countersink any holes that I drilled during assembly, and then do a final sanding on all of the pieces before taking a well-deserved nap. Any remaining sanding dust is blown away. It's finally time for finish. This time I'm using TotalBoat's Danish Teak sealer. It's a penetrating oil finish with an amber tint that brings out the color in darker woods. It's super easy to apply, plus upkeep is easy too, so that's why I chose it for this project. Plus I didn't know if my normal varnish coating would scratch when folding up the chair. Application is very similar to a wood stain, where you apply it pretty heavily with a brush, let it sit for about 30 minutes to soak into the grain, and then come back and wipe up any excess that's still sitting on the surface. I do this twice, applying 2 coats with a day between coats. Reassembly is both easier and harder than before. Harder because you have to realign your holes, but easier because all the measuring and lining up of pieces has already been done, so it's actually much quicker now. I left the leg rest off for weight savings on the pair that I'm gifting, and I'm glad that I did that because I didn't think these would be quite as heavy as they ended up being, since I thought it was a good idea to use white oak for some reason. So leaving that off will make it easier to PCS. With these wrapped up, it's time to pack them up and deliver them to Miles, the recipient of these chairs. He's a local veteran who was able to purchase a house last year thanks to Veterans United Home Loans. Veterans United is the nation's #1 VA purchase lender, dedicated to helping veterans, service members, and military families achieve the dream of home ownership. They challenged me to create something that would specifically be useful for a veteran in their new home. As a military spouse, it's a lifestyle that I know all too well, and the first thing that comes to mind for me was PCSing. It's a fancy initialism that we use to make ourselves feel special. It's also known as moving. It's a process I've shown you guys in previous videos. My biggest challenge is moving all my tools, but for most military families, it's their furniture. A lot just avoid owning any nice furniture, and on that list of avoided furniture is definitely bulky Adirondack chairs. This new Adirondack chair is only 13 inches thick when folded, a very reasonable size to both store it and be able to PCS with it. Huge shout out to Veterans United for partnering on this build, and an even bigger thank you for what they do to support our service members and their families. You can learn more about them at the link down below.
I was hoping you guys would bring that big giant skate that you made. Was it like a
the
roller?
boot? The boot? The boot. Yeah.
Oh, the boot.
Yeah.
I still have
If
that.
you want to come by, you can drive it around.
I was like, maybe we're getting the boot.
You guys want it?